Hello, Senator Bruce Tarr. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
I'm well. I'm well. It's good to see you again. I
It's
heard
good to see you.
you had a little brush with the virus, but you're feeling better, right?
I did indeed. I'm actually feeling good now, but like so many people, I contracted COVID-19 and had to quarantine for a while and then had to wear a mask if I was going to be out in public, which I did do.
Mhm.
And was very fortunate that yesterday I tested negative. So hopefully that's the end of this experience with it. But, it's something that's affected a lot of people, and my symptoms could have been much, much worse than they were. So I'm grateful for that. But I think it's important for all of us that if we do encounter in our own lives COVID-19, that we take the appropriate steps, that we make sure we test, and that we do the things we need to do to protect other people. And I was happy to do that. And I would hope that we would all do that.
Yes, I agree. Well, thank you for that. And I'm glad you're feeling better.
Thank you.
So let's talk about something that's on everyone's mind, and that is how to keep our homes warm this winter. It's going to be very expensive and it's going to be hard to get. So or maybe not so hard to get. I shouldn't say that. Tell us what the issue.
Well, it's a little unclear, actually, Heather, because there are some concerns about supply. And in fact, the 6 New England governors have been in correspondence with Secretary Granholm, the U.S. Secretary of Energy, talking about how to make sure we have enough supply, particularly of things like natural gas, which is a major fuel source for New England, both for home heating and the generation of electricity. And those conversations have been going back and forth about just how to do that. And of course, I know we saw most recently in the media that the congressional delegation, the federal legislative delegation, has also asked for help with that in terms of releasing some of our strategic fuel supplies to be able to make sure that those things are available. But part of the problem is, Heather, that it's a global market, and there's a tremendous uptake of any available natural gas into the European markets and other places because of the instability that's been created by Russia invading Ukraine. And so the consequences of that have been felt, I would argue, around the globe. And so this is a very, very challenging situation. But the governors are working on it with the secretary and the federal legislative delegation. And certainly at the State House, we talk about this quite a bit because we do want to make sure that there are adequate supplies of these things. But I have to mention that one of the things we're also working on is trying to increase our supply of renewable energy so that we won't be as subject to the difficulties that are involved with fossil fuels, which are oftentimes the subject of geopolitics and global markets. But if we can generate more of the energy we need domestically, then we'll be less threatened and less jeopardized by some of those volatilities that happen in global markets.
This is certainly showing our vulnerability to fossil fuels, that's for sure. So we were talking before we started recording about the Jones Act, and I think that's pretty interesting. Can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. There's an interesting nuance to this, Heather. And for those that aren't familiar with the Jones Act, it was intended originally, and I would suspect still is, intended to promote the development of U.S. shipping and the operation of U.S. shipping. So it deals with ships that have a foreign flag, and it restricts their ability essentially to go between multiple U.S. ports without making a stop internationally in a non-U.S. port. And the idea behind that was to encourage U.S. shipping to be able to do the coastal kind of routes that go from U.S. port to U.S. port. But in this case, it has ramifications for our energy supply because a lot of the LNG tankers that we depend on to bring us extra fuel are foreign flagged. And so Governor Baker has been in a conversation with the folks in Washington about how there might be some relief from that so that conceivably a foreign flag ship could go from one port to another to bring the LNG into our ports. And three principally, there are two offshore, as we know, because Cape Ann was involved in the permitting discussions for those, and then certainly the Port of Boston. And when there's a high demand for natural gas, those ports become very important, primarily actually gas coming into Boston, which is then brought to supply tanks or storage tanks around the region that hold them in reserve so that the gas can be put into the system when it's needed. So it's a very complicated situation. And the Jones Act has arisen as an issue that might be constraining in terms of getting us some of the LNG that we need.
Mm. And so people have asked for relief from the Jones Act. Is that
There's been a discussion about whether or not, in response to a difficult time with regard to supplies of natural gas, there could be some sort of a blanket exemption for the tankers that are carrying that gas from the restrictions of the Jones Act. And as I understand it, and again, we were just briefed on this week, but as I understand it, the federal government doesn't have the ability under the law to give a blanket exemption for a particular situation or a particular time. It has to be undertaken one at a time. And of course, that's certainly possible, but it's bureaucratically cumbersome, particularly if we get into a situation where gas needs to come quickly, again, in the form of LNG that's on a tanker.
Well, let's talk about how families can actually receive relief in their heating bills.
So it's really important, and this is the time of year when we ask people to really think about this and think about whether they might need some help. And of course, there is a program in Massachusetts. It's actually funded largely by the federal government with assistance from the state government, called LIHEAP, the Low Income Housing Energy Assistance Program. And locally, it's administered by the incredibly talented and resourceful folks at Action Energy, led by Elliot Jacobson. And they have really over the years developed a lot of proficiency and expertise in this area. And in other parts of the state, there are similar agencies that run this program. They're usually referred to as CAPS, Community Action Programs. But we have Action, and we want to make sure that people know that they can now apply because applications were not being received up until quite recently, but now is the time. And it's important to think about the fact that the eligible heating costs run from November 1st to April 30th. So that's considered to be the heating season for which you can get assistance. And one of the things that's interesting about this, Heather, is we often think that this is a program that may not help a lot of folks because they're income ineligible. But actually, we had pulled the chart and we're looking at it. And the chart indicates that for a single family household, the maximum income is $42,411. And I think that would surprise a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And for a family of two or a household of two, the maximum income is $55,461. And for a household of three, it's $68,511. Now, certainly those aren't huge amounts of money. But we want people to know that they could be eligible if they meet those criteria. And one of the things that we encourage them to do is apply now and think about the future so that you don't wind up in a crisis situation where you don't have heat in your home. That's certainly a public health threat. It's certainly not something that we want to see happen to anyone. So the time is now to think about this and to think about applying and thinking about your eligibility. And so on our social media, on my Facebook page and on tartalk.com, we've put the information out about how to reach the Community Action Program, in this case, Action. But I think most folks that will be watching us are familiar with Action. I certainly hope they are. And Action Energy is the entity that administers the program locally. So we want to encourage folks to think about that and reach out and be proactive, even as we try to work collectively in government to make sure that we have the supplies of energy that people need.
Well, thank you for that. And we will make sure the Action Energy site is up in our notes also.
Terrific.
Now, there's a story that we keep covering every single week. I think we cover the economic development bill and the closeout supplemental budget. So any news on those two?
I think, Heather, we should actually have an official segment dedicated to those two things.
And if they get settled, we should just keep talking about it anyway.
Well, these are issues that are actually fairly frequently discussed on Beacon Hill. But I think the one thing that I would call attention to is that we really do need soon to take some action, at least on the closeout supplemental budget, because the comptroller needs to close the books of the Commonwealth for the prior fiscal year 2022. And they can't do that until we act to somehow direct where these funds are going. And as we've talked about, there was a very large surplus in fiscal year 2022, and Governor Baker filed a closeout supplemental budget back at the end of August. And he was very careful about what he did because he left enough money not in the closeout sup to accommodate the tax rebates under Chapter 62F that are going to be coming forward very shortly, and the tax cuts in the economic development bill and the spending in the economic development bill. So the governor tried to create a situation where the options were open to the legislature.
Mhm.
The difficulty is, and we've talked about this before, and I apologize for being redundant,
It's
but
okay. We need to hear it a lot.
well, okay. Well, we're in a situation where, because we're in informal session, any member can object to any of these bills being taken up. And so it's going to take a tremendous amount of work to go into consensus building to be able to get any of these passed. But I know the conferees are still talking about the economic development bill. I'm sure there are discussions that are happening also with regard to the closeout sup. But the driving factor right now is the need to close the books on the prior fiscal year. So I would say this is a story that bears watching, and I would say in advance for next week, we should probably put aside the segment on closeout subs and economic development bills.
Yeah. All right, that we'll just have that special one always at the end. And so, as you said, the Chapter 62F refunds, we're calling them, right? Or will be on their way soon?
You know, that's an important subject to talk about for a minute, Heather, because the way that the regulations had worked, it would have been a tax credit applied to next year's tax filing, but the Baker administration has chosen to change the regulations, and that process just recently ended, so that rebates could actually go out as opposed to tax credits. And so the expectation is that sometime in November, we are going to see those rebates for about, I think, 13% of what folks paid in taxes. And that number is a moving target, but I think that's a good approximation.
Okay. And the rebates could not go out until the last tax filings happened, right? So
that's correct. Yep.
Right. Good. All right. Well, that's some good news, and we'll just wait and see what the next chapter of the economic development bill and the closeout sup is.
Well, absolutely. And, you know, a point was made to me yesterday by one of my colleagues that Massachusetts really has had good fiscal discipline because we are able to spend a lot of money on schools that lead the nation in education. And we're able to do other things that are important in terms of supporting our seniors and supporting our veterans and so many other things, and still have the ability to provide a very substantial tax rebate. So it was not lost on me that the fiscal discipline that we've had has been very important and will continue to be important.
Yes, and you are a champion of fiscal discipline. We know that.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And hopefully we see you next week. And I'm glad you're feeling better.
Thank you so much, Heather. I'm delighted to be feeling better. And I hope that you get a chance this afternoon with what's left of it to get outside and be able to do some things in the wonderful Cape Ann sunshine that we're experiencing.
I'm going to do that right now. All right. Thank you. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Interested in a sponsorship? Email sponsor@1623studios.org to learn more.